Okay, good. Well, we're going to continue with looking at David. We've had a bit of a break. It's bit of a while since the last sermon, so I hope your memories are good. But anyway, we'll press on to the next instalment of David's life. But by way of introduction, God's got purposes for each of us, and it's purposes in many different areas, I suppose. But it could be, for most obvious thing, perhaps is in ministry, or it could be his purposes in just straightening out our lives, because that's part of sanctification. Or it may simply be just his purpose to save us, and we're waiting for that day when Christ returns, and we'll be finally saved, and that is part of God's purpose as well, which is working out in our lives. And of course, no different for David, and we know particularly for David, one of the purposes God had for him was that he should become king. And that's what we'll be focusing on this afternoon. Good question, of course, is will these purposes be fulfilled for us? Well, I've called this sermon "Pressing Through," or rather a bit too long, really, of title, but "Pressing Through to Fulfilment of His Purposes." So we're going to look at the life of David and see how he pressed through to achieve that purpose of God making him king. And hopefully, we can learn a few lessons from David, and so that we, in our own lives, can fulfill God's purposes for us. And as usual, it's probably very helpful for you to have your Bibles open, because I can't read all the verses. There's just too many. The sermon would get far too long. So I'm just going to have to read out what I consider to be more helpful parts. But it might be helpful if you can just follow them, just at least glance at the passages which I might refer to. But just as a quick recap of the last sermon, last time we looked at David, that focused on God's providence in David's life. And there were a number of different situations. One was David's dealing with Nabal and Abigail, and God in his providence helped David to save David from taking a terrible revenge on Nabal and his household. And then there was that occasion where God enabled, when David and all his men's families had been taken away from Ziklag by the Amalekite band, God in his providence enabled them to catch up with the Amalekites and recover all. And then the other one was that sticky situation where David was having to fight on the Philistines' side against Israel. But God got him out of that sticky one as well by his providence. So those, well, obviously, the significant things for David. But there was a much more important event which happened after that for the life of the nation. And we didn't read it, but in the final chapter of 1 Samuel, we can read about the outcome of that battle that David managed to avoid. That battle with the Philistines, and it describes how King Saul dies on Mount Gilboa, wounded by the Philistine archers, and then he commits suicide, falling on his sword because of fear of being abused by the Philistines if they came upon him. So it wasn't a good end for Saul, not a good end to a failed rule. So that's the backdrop to the start of 2 Samuel. Now, you might wonder why Samuel's been divided into two. In fact, it has been divided into two, because it used to be one book, but probably it was split into 1 and 2 Samuel to fit on standard lengths of scrolls. You imagine if your story is too long, the scroll gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It becomes unwieldy, so it must have been split at some point. But the reason for it being split at the point that it was, after the death of Saul, was it was a significant turning point in David's history, because David had endured years of hounding by Saul. Saul had been chasing him around the country, David having to hide, evade him all the time, and his life was always on a knife edge. But now Saul was dead, and David is poised to become king. So it's a significant time in the life of the nation, and for David as well. So a good point to divide the book up. Now, of course, the time for David when he was waiting to become king, when he was in the wildernesses and hiding from Saul, that was a testing and a refining time. And in a true sense, it was a wilderness time for him. Probably for, I don't know, different chronologies, people got different opinions. Probably for about 8 years, he was being chased around by Saul. But those years weren't wasted years, because during that time, he had this band of men that gathered to him. During that time, he was learning to handle men, and they must have been a bit of a handful, some of those men, all those malcontents and the odd bods that gathered to him. So he's learning to handle men, and like us as well, he had to learn to fight inner battles with himself, and he learned to rely on God. And of course, he ended up with many a testimony. We should have invited him to one of our meetings, because he must have had so many. Well, we know he had so many testimonies to God's deliverance. In fact, we got them written down, so maybe we don't need to invite him. But yeah, so yeah, he had many a testimony to God's deliverance, and he learned to trust God in a very thoroughgoing way. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised if we go through wilderness experiences, wilderness years. And sometimes I think, I don't know how you feel, but sometimes I feel as though all our lives are a bit of a wilderness. But nevertheless, we need to keep walking with God, and just like David did. And our lives won't be wasted, even though we may just seem to be drifting through and waiting, not great things happening to us or whatever, or through our lives. But every day we live counts. Every day we live walking with God counts, and it'll count for the future in some way. But God had been with David, and now he's got credibility to become the next king of Israel. And as we get to the next phase of David's life, we can see just how he stands out head and shoulders, morally especially, above the people and the situations which he finds himself in. And this helped to carry him through a number of critical situations. And of course, Saul, King Saul, it's recorded about him that he was physically head and shoulders above everybody. King Saul stood out head and shoulders physically, but he failed, even though he was anointed. So David is ready now for the final push to become king. He's poised to take up his reign, because life is really easy sailing. There's always something that seems to crop up. And David has a number of hazards to negotiate before he can take his place. And a man with an eye to the top, an eye for the top, and only for reaching the top, you might slip up. But a right heart will help a man to keep on the right road. And David had a right heart, and he did keep on the right road. So let's go to think about the start of 2 Samuel. So perhaps if you want to turn to the first chapter of 2 Samuel. And in the first chapter of 2 Samuel, David has returned to Ziklag after chasing after the Amalekites and rescuing their families. But a man comes into their midst with his clothes torn and dust on his head. He has escaped from the battle with the Philistines, and he reports that Israel has been soundly defeated by the Philistines, and Saul is dead, and 3 of Saul's sons, including Jonathan. And David's very concerned about what had happened in the battle with the Philistines, on a number of levels, because clearly it affected everyone in Israel. And how many have been killed, and that affects so many people. And probably thought about some of his ex-army comrades. No, had they been killed? Had they been wounded? What had happened to them? And he had a military interest as well as a professional soldier. But maybe above all, he was perhaps interested to know about what happened to Jonathan and even Saul, and how were they? How they fared in the battle. So he questions the young man further, and the man says, "The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen, dead, and Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also." Must have been terrible words for David to hear, because obviously he really loved Jonathan, and the truth is he loved Saul as well. So he wants to be certain that this news was really true. He wants to know. So he wants to know if this really was true. So he questions the young man, and the young man claims to have actually said, "No, I actually killed him. I actually killed Saul myself at his own request, like as a mercy killing. No, because he was wounded. He inevitably would have died." What verse is this? Chapter 10 and chapter 1 verse 10. "So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he'd fallen." And he goes on to say, "And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." So that was quite convincing evidence, wasn't it? Not only did he have the verbal testimony of a man who was there, but he'd actually brought the crown and bracelet, the signs of Saul's signs of kingship, and brought them to David. So he must have been there. He must have been an eyewitness. So David's convinced, and it was, of course, it was true as well. Interestingly, if you've read the last chapter of 1 Samuel, his account doesn't quite tie in with that. Some dispute. Some say this man is just filling in more detail. Others say he was just lying because he wanted to get a reward. Clearly, he was there. Nevertheless, it seems to me that he was lying, but I could be wrong. But David has refrained from killing Saul a number of times out of respect for God and for the anointing upon Saul as king. And he never permitted his men to kill Saul when they had the chance. But now this young man brazenly comes into his camp and claims to have killed him. And what's worse for this young man is that he's an Amalekite. So he's not like to get much sympathy from David, but partly because God had put a curse on the Amalekites and said that Israel should kill all the Amalekites. And secondly, because the Amalekites had just taken, that band of Amalekites had just taken away all his family, and they'd just been slaughtering the Amalekites. But mostly because he'd actually had the audacity to kill the Lord, or claim at least to have killed the Lord's anointed, to have killed the King Saul. So David had him executed. Now, at this point, an ordinary power-hungry man might have organized a party, because Saul, the king, was dead. The sons of Saul were dead, and the way was open for David to become king. Now, that's a good cause for a party, you might say. And you might even have a praise time as well, for God dealt with Saul as he deserved. But this is the first banana skin for David at this time. Slipping on it would dented his credibility in the eyes of Israel, because what it would have said, it would have said that he was in direct opposition to Saul. Now, it's true that Saul was his enemy, but David was never the enemy, never really the enemy of Saul. David was always loyal to Saul, but perception by the country was really important. And most of Israel still had high respect for Saul. So David needed to maintain credibility. That was crucial for his ambition as king. And David was genuinely grieved for Saul and for Jonathan and the dead in Israel. And his heartfelt grief comes out in the Song of the Bow, which is in starts in verse 19 of chapter 1. It's not surprising to have grief over Jonathan, his friend, who'd been a faithful, self-sacrificing friend and supported him when he was in difficulty. But it's a bit more surprising that David, probably in the eyes of many anyway, that David should grieve over his enemy Saul, but he did. And we get some. It is actually rather a lovely song that David composed and sang. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. The beauty of Israel, being the glory of Israel, another word, is Saul slain on your high places. And in fact, the word beauty can actually be translated as gazelle. It's a bit like a picture of a beautiful creature bounding with life and energy, suddenly dead. Saul suddenly dead. Verse 23, Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and then in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. And speaking of their bravery and their strength. And he goes on, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war perished. And this wasn't just a passing lament he made up for the day to be forgotten the next day, but he commanded it to be taught to the people and recorded in the Book of Jasher. Now, Book of Jasher means the scroll of the righteous, it seems, and it probably recorded all the heroic exploits of the Israelites over time. It's first mentioned in Joshua chapter 10. Apart from that, we don't know anything about it. It's not been preserved for us. But one thing that this song showed was the people was that David didn't have negative feelings towards Saul. Because for David, the whole thing was bad news. The death of Saul and Jonathan, rejoicing of the Philistines, how he hated the thought that the Philistines would be there rejoicing. In fact, maybe Philistines coming back from the battle, they'd be passing his village, his town, or city, wherever it was, and they'd be rejoicing and excited and carrying loot and such like. And the shame on Israel of being defeated. Death of all the men, the soldiers, and loss of villages taken over perhaps by the Philistines, looted by the villagers. So he grieves very, very deeply. And we see the consistency, important, that we see the consistency of David here. While he's being hunted by Saul, he remained loyal and forgiving and even loving in his attitude. And he preserved Saul's life on a number of occasions. And now Saul is dead. He's still consistent in his feelings for Saul. Because the truth is, he wasn't acting apart. He wasn't acting up to gain credibility with Israel. He wanted credibility with Israel, but he wasn't acting apart. He wasn't pretending to love Saul. He wasn't trying to do the right thing like perhaps we do sometimes. Because when we live from the heart, being real, we've got no trouble being consistent. And we see the same consistency as well in his dealing with the Amalekite and executing the Amalekite for killing the Lord's anointed. A lesser man might have rewarded the Amalekite because it was to David's advantage what the Amalekite had told him. And seemingly the Amalekite probably expected a reward as well. So we see this consistency of love and respect for Saul. So this was a very low point for Israel, defeated and looted and killed, dead, and no king. It's a terrible time for Israel. But the tide was going to turn for Israel, but not quite yet. So let's come to 2 Samuel chapter 2. I'll just read the first 4 verses. It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "Where shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household. So they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Just as an aside, actually, it's interesting that how David inquires of the Lord. He doesn't ask for a big, long explanation of what he should do. He asks simple things of the Lord. Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? Yes or no? That's easy to get an answer back to a yes and no. When he's got that yes, he asks another question. Where shall I go? To Hebron. Maybe there's something in that for when it comes to seeking the Lord and seeking for guidance. Maybe just keep it simple, one thing at a time, one step at a time. Anyway, that's by the by. There's now a vacuum left in Israel at the top in Israel. There's no king, and circumstances had worked in David's favor, and circumstances strongly indicated that now was the time to claim the throne, and that's what was in David's mind in seeking the Lord here. Of course, no one. Now that no one was hunting him, David was quite free to go up to any of the cities of Judah, where his natural support was. The question was which city, and was it the right time? But just thinking about circumstances, someone has written that circumstances should be the last, not the first consideration in doing the will of God. Circumstances should be the last, not the first consideration in doing the will of God. In other words, circumstances may point toward the will of God, but there's no definite assurance of the will of God. We can't just go by circumstances seeming to indicate something. We really need to be looking for additional evidence, if you like, additional indications of the will of God, rather than relying just on circumstances. So David is still cautious to inquire of the Lord, and as we just read, he's got to get this right. He doesn't want to put his foot wrong in this situation. He doesn't want to lean on his own understanding, and he doesn't. And it is hard in these situations to know what's for the best. But one of the blessings of following the Lord is that he does give wisdom. As it says in James, he gives wisdom liberally to those who ask without reproach. So we can go to the Lord and he will give us wisdom. He will direct us. And God directs him to go to Hebron, a major city in Judah. So he goes with his wives and his men. And there he is actually anointed as king over Judah, over his own tribe, but not over all Israel at this point. And it's interesting to note that he waited for the men of Judah to come to him, verse 4. Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. He didn't have himself proclaimed king as soon as he got there, because again, he wanted to carry the people with him. He wanted them to crown him king. He didn't want to look like some opportunist tyrant who'd come in and grabbed an opportunity. So the problem now he's anointed king over Judah, but the problem confronting him now is how is he going to be made king over the whole nation, not just Judah? He needs to get all the tribes united behind him as king. He wants to win them over. So the question was, how is he going to do it? Well, his first step, let me read on a bit more from second half of verse 4, chapter 2. Well, I'll read it again. Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, The men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, "You are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I will also repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. Now, therefore, let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." So his first step in seeking to win over the rest of the tribes of Israel was to praise the men of Gilead. They were of the tribe of Gad, and they lived on the other side of the Jordan, on the east bank of the Jordan. But what they'd done after the battle with the Philistines, where Saul had been killed, the Philistines had fastened Saul's body to the walls of Beth Shan, city on the west side of the Jordan. But the men of Jabesh Gilead had crossed over the Jordan and gone through Philistine lines, and they'd removed Saul's body from the city wall of Beth Shan. So clearly they were strong supporters of Saul. And it's no wonder, because if you remember back, Saul at the start of his reign had saved Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites. The Ammonite king had said he was going to gouge out the right eyes of all the men in Jabesh Gilead. But Saul, the Spirit came upon Saul, and he blew the trumpet, and he attacked them, and the Ammonites defeated them and saved Jabesh Gilead. So the men of Jabesh Gilead were very, very thankful to Saul, and that no doubt was the reason why they came and took away the humiliation of Saul being nailed up onto the wall, and they buried him. So they were strong supporters of Saul, even though they weren't Benjaminites like Saul. So David is showing that he's got no bad feeling towards Saul, because he's promising rewards to these supporters of Saul, these men who had rescued Saul's body. But he also suggests that now their master Saul is dead, and they may as well face the fact that Saul is dead, but they should use their proven valor in support of David and of him, his anointed successor. It's politics, really, isn't it? But it's politics of the best sort. There's no hypocrisy in David in this. So David was a politician as well as an accomplished soldier and an accomplished leader of men, and a very accomplished musician. He's a remarkable man. So things are going well. Things are going well for David now. But let's just read some more. Let's read from verse 8 now of chapter 2. Things have been going well, but again, David's got some more hazards to face, some pushbacks on his ambition. Verse 8, but Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. And then just verse 1 of chapter 3. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Well, things were going well for David, but as I say, there's a bit of a pushback now, civil war. Unfortunately, not everyone is wise and understands the will of God, or is willing to submit to the will of God. And the commander of Saul's army, Abner, felt obliged to proclaim Saul's son Ishbosheth as king. This is Saul's remaining son, who hadn't presumably gone to the battle. But this led to 7 years of war between the supporters of David and Abner. But David grew stronger, and Saul's son Ishbosheth grew weaker. And in the end, Abner, the commander of Ishbosheth's army, he falls out with this Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth really is not a he's not got a lot of character. He's weak and he's passive and he's not very wise. And Abner falls out with him. And Abner can see as well that he's not winning the war with David. So he decides to throw in his lot with David. He sides with David. And to this end, he also convinces the elders of Israel and the people of Benjamin to support this move to make David king. So David now, he must have been on a roll. He's almost there now. He's got the support. He's gained the support of the nation. But of course, we know when things are going well, you've got to watch it, haven't you? So you've got to be ready. Satan doesn't give up easy. And 2 murders happen, which could have undermined David's credibility, carefully cultivated credibility. And the first was the murder of Abner by Joab. So again, I'll read 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 20 to 30 now. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 20. So Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Then Abner said to David, I'll arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. At that moment, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. Repeats that. When Joab and all the troops that were with him had come, they told Joab, saying, Abner, the son of Ner, came to the king, and he sent him away, and he's gone in peace. Then, again, it mentions peace. Then Joab came to the king and said, What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why is it that you sent him away, and he has already gone? Surely you realize that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you, to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you're doing. And when Joab had gone from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, who brought him back from the well of Sirah. But David did not know it. Now, when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately, and there stabbed him in the stomach so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. Afterward, when David heard it, he said, My kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has a discharge or is a leper, who leans on a staff or falls by the sword or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. So Abner had met with David, promised to bring all Israel over to him. David made a feast for him and sent him away in peace. And Joab calls Abner back and he stabs him in the stomach. This is in revenge for Abner having killed his brother. Don't know if you remember, but after the battle, well, this is one of the battles which we didn't actually read about, but between David and David's men and Abner's men. Abner was running away, and Joab's brother was chasing him. Abner had a spear. I don't think Asahel was as well equipped. Abner tells him to go and stop. Don't try and catch me. And he pokes Joab's brother in the stomach with the blunt end of his spear. Unfortunately, he's a bit too strong, and it went through his stomach and killed him. He didn't intend to kill him. He must have intended to disable him, basically, wound him, maybe even just. But he killed him, and Joab wanted revenge, so he kills Abner. And maybe Joab had a couple of other reasons for killing Abner. Maybe he presumably genuinely believed that Abner hadn't changed sides. He was just spying out the land. Maybe he was influenced by his hatred for Abner. And maybe he also feared for his job as commander of David's army, because Abner could perhaps expect some sort of reward for changing sides. And the most obvious thing may be command of the army. So we don't know about that. That's speculative, but it's a possibility. But David could look really bad now, because Joab was his general, and people would certainly assume that he instructed Joab to kill Abner, to establish himself more firmly with no opposition. And so again, it would have made things difficult for David to get the other tribes to unite behind him. So what can David do about that? The dirty deed's been done, but he does what he can to convince the people otherwise. He takes action. He doesn't wring his hands and bemoan the situation. He rises to the occasion, just like he did at Ziklag when all his family had been taken away. He rose to the occasion and he took action. And so reading on then from verse 31, chapter 3. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes, gird yourselves with sackcloth, and mourn for Abner." And King David followed the coffin. Note it says King David there. First time when he's following the coffin. King David followed the coffin. So they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king sang a lament over Abner and said, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put into fetters. As a man falls before wicked men, so you fell." Then all the people wept over him again. And when all the people came to persuade David to eat food while he was still day, David took an oath, saying, "God do so to me, and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." Now all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, since whatever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's intent to kill Abner, the son of Ner. Then the king said to his servants, "Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am weak today, though anointed king. And these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me. The Lord shall repay the evildoer according to his wickedness." Of course, the sons of Zeruiah were Joab and Abishai, his brother. So David compelled Joab and his people to show outward signs of deep mourning. And also David wept at the grave and sang a lament over Abner. It was so genuine and it was so heartfelt that it moved the people to tears afresh. I don't think if it hadn't been genuine, people wouldn't have been moved. It was patently, he was patently honest and deeply grieving for what had happened. And he also fasted as well. He didn't have to do that, but he did. Again, it's a sign, an outward sign of his mourning. And the result was in verse 37 that he managed to convince, verse 37, "For all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's intent to kill Abner, the son of Ner." So he manages to convince the people that he was not behind the murder. And as I said, he couldn't have been able to do that unless his feelings were genuine. So that was another banana skin avoided. I made a point of mentioning about David being called King David in that verse 31 as he followed the coffin. And it repeatedly calls David king in those verses, about 7 times in those verses I've just read. This is for the first time. It wasn't called King David before, I think, except maybe Abner or David, but yeah, it's Abner. The only previous reference to calling him king was in verse 21 when Abner talks about David as being my lord the king. But there's obviously a heavy emphasis on David being king in these verses in association with this with this funeral. Now, it's not exactly clear why it should be, but it seems to be in some way that David's demeanor at this funeral established him as king in the eyes of Israel at this time. Of course, David should theoretically have executed Joab because it was just murder. But David was still weak politically, and although he was the king, and he still needed the support of the sons of Zeruiah. But what he did do was pronounce a curse on Joab and his family. That was in verse 29. Let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one with a discharge, or is a leper, leans on a staff, falls by the sword, who lacks bread. Now, how that worked out, I don't know, but actually, it's quite interesting. When I've been reading about David in his later life, Joab actually lives out in the desert area. That's where he made his home. I did wonder whether that was maybe he did become a leper. Maybe that was why he's out in the desert. That's pure speculation. It could have been just he got cynical and fed up with political life or something like that. I don't know. Withdrawn from society. I don't know. But I have wondered in the past whether, because if you're a leper, you would isolate yourself. But anyway, there's no particular other reason other than that to suppose that he did get leprosy. But nevertheless, David did put a curse on Joab's family. But again, it just said what his feelings were, and they didn't support Joab in what he'd done. David was steering a difficult course at this time, and life's imperfect. Now, we have to do the best we can in the circumstances we find ourselves in. So he didn't execute Joab, although at this time, in the distant future, he was executed by his son, by Solomon. Politics is the art of the possible, not the art of the impossible. No point trying to do the impossible. Politics, the art of the possible. So, and then the second murder, or if you want to call it the third pushback against David becoming king, was the murder of Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who had been proclaimed king of Israel by Abner. Obviously, Ishbosheth's in a bad place now because he's basically been abandoned by the rest of Israel, and Abner's been murdered. He's on his own now. So two of Ishbosheth's captains kill him on his bed, and they take his head to David. Maybe they're just taking advantage of Ishbosheth's weakness, perhaps, and they're transferring sides as well. And they say in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 8, "Here's a head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. And the Lord has avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and his descendants." These two men seem to think that their murderous deed was endorsed by God, and that God had used them to avenge David. And very likely, again, they expected a reward. But you can just see how blind and self-deceived wicked people can be. They just didn't understand God's heart and God's ways, and so they couldn't understand David's heart or his ways either. The truth is, ungodly people can't understand righteousness, and they attribute evil to even to the righteous, because they are evil, their hearts are evil. They don't understand righteousness. David didn't need murderous conspirators on his side to further his purpose, and he makes an example of them in verses 11 and 12, chapter 4. He executes them on the spot, making a public example of them. So again, another occasion where people might have thought David complicit, but he shows by swift justice that wasn't the case, because people are quick to attribute evil if appearances point that way, unfortunately. So David's king of Judah. Now he becomes king over all Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, "Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel." Therefore all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So this time it's all Israel that comes to David to make him king. Again, doesn't proclaim himself king. All Israel come to make him king. And perhaps there's 5 things that might particularly attributed to David being accepted as king. First of all, of course, God had anointed him for the task. There were no alternatives. Ishmael was dead, and Abner was dead, and of course Saul was dead. And David had proved himself to be an impressive military leader in the past, which is really vital when you've got constant battles going on with the Philistines and maybe other countries on the borders. And of course, Abner had endorsed David before Abner was murdered. And David had shown proper respect to the leaders of Saul's dynasty, to Saul himself and to Abner and to even to Ishmael. So David now is king. He's got there. God's purpose for David has been fulfilled. So again, it's a big another milestone in the life of David. He's got to consolidate his position as king and get the nation on a better footing after, as I said, it was in a very low place. But that's for the next sermon, God willing. This is just an aside and a lesson I've taken from one of the books I was reading. It doesn't necessarily follow on as a necessary, I might call it, teaching from the scriptures directly, but it's a thought which might be helpful. But David had been partially made king over Israel, over the tribe of Judah, hadn't he, initially? It's just over one tribe at first. That he was king over Hebron. The word Hebron has a basic sense of meaning of unite, but it's got a range of meanings, really, from colleague to friend, or even community or alliance. But a lot of it suggests the idea of fellowship. And just the thought which was in this book was that some people only allow Jesus to be partially king over their lives. They allow fellowship with God, they enjoy fellowship with God, but they don't allow God complete rule over their lives. In fact, that couple of verses from that A.B. Simpson hymn that we sang, it says, what was it? It was once a half salvation, now the uttermost. And a lot of people, their Christianity can be a half salvation. They enjoy the blessings, they go to the meetings and they clap their hands and it's all jolly. But the Lord doesn't fully reign over their lives. And just as in David just being partial king, only able to be partial king over the tribe of Judah, that brought about civil war. And if we only allow the Lord to be partial king in our lives, then but we get civil war in our own lives as well. We can't be at peace within ourselves when there's two camps in our lives, because they're always vying with one another. We know the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh, and it's a constant battle. But the reason it's a constant battle so often is because we've not yielded the flesh up. We've not made Jesus Lord over the whole of our lives. And of course, our conscience can't be at rest either. It's always being challenged all the time. And just as Jesus doesn't force his kingship upon us, and just as David didn't force his rule upon Israel either, we've got to choose to let the Lord rule over all the land, over all our hearts, and we'll find a lot more rest and a lot more peace if we can do that. So in coming to conclusion then, we could ask ourselves why or how David was successful in fulfilling God's purpose in his becoming king. The answer to that maybe help us as well to fulfill God's purposes in our lives, whatever those purposes might be, in whatever area. Well, first of all, for David, it was God's purpose. God was with David to enable it to come to pass, enable him to become king. And when we look at David's trials, we can see that in the natural, it just wouldn't have happened. There's no way that David, under normal circumstances, would have become king. Well, partly because he had so many difficulties to overcome. But anyway, in any case, what chance is a nobody teenager got of becoming king. It doesn't happen in real life, or so rarely that there was just no chance. But God made it happen. So that's important, vitally important. And we can be confident that God will play his part in to enable us to fulfill all that he wants to fulfill in our lives, all that his purposes are for us in his life. If we trust him as David did. Someone has said, no one can take away from us what God has planned for us. No one can take away from us what God has planned for us. Although maybe I'm sure we can take away from ourselves some things that God has planned for us, because we have to play our part as well. And the truth is that that many fail to enter into all that God has purposed for them because they don't play their part. And David, he worked to bring to pass what God wanted. David could have retired after being anointed as king. David could have retired to a quiet corner of Israel and waited for them all to come and make him king. But it never would have happened if he just gone hid himself somewhere. He had to act as well. Yeah, God's sovereignty, and you could say, oh, well, his will come to pass anyway. But and that is sort of like true. God is sovereign, but in the case of David, in his sovereignty, he chose a man who he could see would do all his will. It says in Acts 13, I found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. So God was working, and he knew David had the right heart to work as well, to bring about his purposes. So it takes God and us working together to fulfill his purposes for us. But the good news is that God has given us a new nature after his own heart, a heart to do his will. So we've got a nature, or we have got a nature. God's given us the nature, and I suppose like David had, a heart to do God's will. So those are two things. But what about from a character point of view? Well, David was patient. He waited maybe 8 years while he was being hounded by Saul. He didn't give up. David was persistent. He had to go through many tough experiences and hardships, and he shed many tears to gain his rightful place as king. It says in Psalm, is it 56, 58 about you've numbered my wanderings, and about putting his tears in God's bottle. So I don't know if that bottle of David's tears is laid up in heaven somewhere in some. I did I mention another last time about a museum in heaven, exhibition in heaven. Yeah, many tears. He shed many tears. We probably don't realise just how painful it was for him. We never realise how painful it is for other people. We only realise our own pains, don't we, unfortunately? And David was morally consistent as well. He remained loyal despite every temptation to the contrary. When he was hunted by Saul, in executing the Amalekite, in grief after Saul's death. And these things gave him the credibility that he needed to become king. So he's morally consistent. He was a consistent man. And he was wise as well. He foresaw hazards and acted wisely to avoid them. Like after, again, the murder of Abner and Ishmael, he acted in a way which demonstrated clearly to people that he wasn't complicit. So just to finish, my conclusion is that it takes for us to fulfill the purpose of God in our lives, in whatever area it might be, ministry or development of character, salvation. It takes appropriate action on our part. It takes the will of God, the sovereign will of God. It takes the will of God, it takes appropriate action on our part, and a godly character as well to fulfill all his purposes.